Throughout history, white supremacy has claimed power over nations, cultures, and even faith, projecting an illusion of spiritual dominance. But Scripture reveals a higher truth. The forces of oppression, no matter how entrenched, cannot withstand the divine will of God. The spiritual death of white supremacy is not just a symbolic idea. It is unfolding as God's power rises to defend His chosen people. In the Bible, God consistently lifts up the oppressed and brings down the arrogant, demonstrating that spiritual authority belongs to Him alone. The rise of the black god in Scripture reflects this divine reversal, where those long marginalized are now supported by heavenly power, guiding them toward justice, wisdom, and freedom. Every act of oppression faces judgment, and the spiritual foundations of white supremacy are being dismantled as God's light illuminates truth. Believers are called to witness, stand firm, and recognize that spiritual victory is not human-made. It is God's plan, unstoppable and eternal, affirming hope, justice, and empowerment for the black community today. The Bible consistently reveals that God stands on the side of the oppressed, bringing down those who wield power through injustice and pride. White supremacy, which has long sought to dominate through fear, deception, and false authority, is exposed as spiritually weak when measured against God's eternal truth. Across history, countless acts of oppression have appeared invincible, but Scripture shows that no human system can withstand divine justice. God is actively fighting for His people, defending the marginalized, and exposing the lies that have been perpetuated for generations. As the spiritual weaknesses of white supremacy become visible, the faithful are called to recognize the power of God, who overturns oppression with wisdom, strength, and divine strategy. Believers are urged to witness these spiritual victories, to stay steadfast in faith, and to understand that real power lies not in human domination, but in God's righteous authority, which champions justice, uplifts the downtrodden, and promises freedom and hope for all who trust in Him. Spiritual warfare is a reality that spans generations, and Scripture clearly shows that God actively battles oppression on behalf of His people. Throughout history, systems of injustice have sought to dominate and suppress, yet the black nation has always had a divine protector. God's intervention is not abstract. It is visible in the courage, resilience, and breakthroughs experienced by His people. The spiritual battles fought are not merely physical. They are deep, invisible confrontations where truth, faith, and divine power clash against deception and pride. God shields the black nation, guiding them through storms of oppression and inspiring hope, even in the darkest moments. The faithful are called to stand firm, knowing that no weapon formed against them can prevail when God is their defender. This ongoing spiritual warfare reminds us that God's protection is not passive but active, manifesting in justice, empowerment, and restoration. The black nation is under divine guardianship, and every act of faith and resistance contributes to the triumph of righteousness and the dismantling of oppression. White spiritual power, built on deception and false authority, has long sought to dominate hearts, minds, and institutions. Yet Scripture reveals that all human power is temporary when measured against God's eternal truth. The fall of white spiritual power is unfolding as divine justice exposes lies and dismantles oppressive systems. At the same time, black identity is being restored through God's truth in the Bible. Faithful followers are discovering their heritage, purpose, and empowerment in Scripture, understanding that God honors the oppressed and uplifts those who are marginalized. This divine truth strengthens communities, illuminates paths of justice, and restores dignity to generations long subjected to spiritual and societal domination. As white spiritual authority weakens, God's light shines brighter, guiding the black nation toward wisdom, courage, and spiritual victory. Believers are called to embrace their identity in God, stand firm in faith, and witness the transformation that arises when divine truth confronts false power, affirming justice, hope, and empowerment for all. Divine justice is no distant promise. It is happening now. The Bible reveals that God actively defends the oppressed and brings down those who build their power on lies, pride, and injustice. White supremacy and systems of oppression, no matter how strong they appear, are powerless against the righteous will of God. As God fights for his people, the faithful are called to awaken and prepare themselves, recognizing that spiritual victory is not human-made but divine. Awareness and readiness are essential, for God's justice works through both the seen and unseen, dismantling lies and lifting up the marginalized. Believers are urged to stand firm, stay vigilant, and embrace faith, knowing that every act of oppression will face judgment. The coming of divine justice affirms hope, restores dignity, and empowers communities, demonstrating that God's power is unstoppable. Now is the time to awaken spiritually, witness God's work, and participate in the triumph of justice, faith, and righteousness. The final spiritual battle is not fought with human weapons but with faith, truth, and the power of God. Scripture teaches that the victory has already been won through divine authority, yet the world must witness the unfolding of this spiritual triumph. White supremacy and oppressive systems may appear formidable, but their power is temporary and cannot withstand God's righteous judgment. The black people, chosen and protected in God's plan, are part of this divine victory. Every act of faith, every step toward justice, contributes to dismantling oppression and affirming God's will. Believers are called to stand firm, to resist fear, and to align themselves with God's truth, knowing that spiritual victory is assured. The final battle demonstrates that human efforts alone cannot achieve justice. Divine intervention guides, protects, and empowers those whom God has chosen. As the spiritual forces of darkness are defeated, the faithful rise, the oppressed are uplifted, and the black nation is celebrated as an integral part of God's eternal plan. White spiritual control, which has dominated hearts, minds, and religious institutions for centuries, is reaching its inevitable end. Scripture reveals that no human authority, built on lies or pride, can withstand God's truth and justice. The spiritual battle is underway, and God's side is unmistakably clear. He stands with the oppressed, the faithful, and those seeking righteousness. As oppressive systems crumble under divine scrutiny, the truth becomes visible, and the lies of white spiritual dominance are exposed for all to see. Believers are called to recognize God's authority, trust his guidance, and participate in his plan. Spiritual victory does not rely on human strength, but on God's unwavering power and justice. The dismantling of white spiritual control is a testament to divine intervention, offering hope, empowerment, and restoration. Communities who align with God's truth will witness transformation, while oppression falters. In this decisive battle, God's presence is evident, his judgment is just, and his protection of the faithful assures a future of victory, freedom, and spiritual renewal for his people. The fall of white supremacy is not just a political or social shift. It is a spiritual upheaval foretold in Scripture. The black god, a symbol of divine justice and protection, rises to defend his children, those who have endured centuries of oppression and marginalization. As oppressive powers crumble, God's presence becomes evident, guiding, shielding, and empowering his people. The faithful are called to recognize his intervention, to trust in his wisdom, and to take courage in the face of adversity. White supremacy, built on deception and fear, cannot withstand the righteous force of God's hand. The spiritual victory is assured for those aligned with divine truth, and every act of faith contributes to dismantling oppression. This is a time of awakening, where the oppressed see God's justice enacted and experience the restoration of dignity, hope, and freedom. The Black God defends, uplifts, and leads his children into spiritual triumph, marking the beginning of a new era where truth and justice prevail over centuries of lies and control. The spiritual battle intensifies as white-controlled institutions, including churches, begin to fracture under the weight of truth. The Black God is actively fighting for his people, exposing lies, corruption, and hypocrisy that have long oppressed communities. These revelations are not just symbolic. They signal a divine shift, where oppressive systems can no longer maintain control. As white churches split, the faithful witness the unraveling of false authority and the emergence of spiritual clarity. God's power is undeniable, guiding his people toward freedom, justice, and divine truth. Believers are called to observe, learn, and embrace the transformative power at work, understanding that spiritual victory is already in motion. The exposure of deception strengthens communities, empowers the marginalized, and affirms that God's protection is active and personal. Now is the moment to watch, stand firm, and recognize that Black God's intervention is real, visible, and life-changing, bringing hope and liberation to those who align with his plan. The Red Sea moment is a powerful symbol of divine deliverance, a miraculous passage from oppression into freedom. Scripture reminds us that when God opens a way, even the impossible becomes possible. In 2025, prophetic signs are appearing that echo this biblical moment, calling the faithful to recognize God's guidance and step boldly into liberation. White supremacy and oppressive systems are facing collapse, creating a spiritual pathway for those aligned with God's truth. This is not a time for hesitation. The Red Sea moment demands courage, faith, and action. Believers are encouraged to walk through with confidence, trusting that God has already prepared the way. Every prophetic sign points to divine intervention, empowerment, and protection. Those who heed the call will witness transformation, justice, and the fulfillment of God's promises. The Red Sea moment is a reminder that liberation is both imminent and assured, and the faithful must step forward, leaving behind fear, oppression, and doubt, as God leads them into a new era of spiritual victory and divine fulfillment. The awakening of the Black diaspora marks a turning point in spiritual, social, and global consciousness. Communities across the world are uniting, realizing their shared heritage, strength, and divine purpose. As this unity rises, the deceptive foundations of white supremacy begin to collapse, exposed by truth and divine justice. Lies that have been sustained for centuries are failing, and the world witnesses the unraveling of false authority. Scripture reminds us that God lifts up the oppressed and strengthens the marginalized, empowering them to reclaim dignity, faith, and identity. The global awakening is both spiritual and cultural, a powerful movement guided by divine truth, where justice, freedom, and empowerment are celebrated. Believers are called to participate in this awakening, standing strong, embracing solidarity, and trusting in God's plan. White supremacy, built on lies, fear, and oppression, cannot survive against collective awakening and divine intervention. The rise of unity among the Black diaspora signals spiritual victory, the fulfillment of God's promises, and the dawn of a new era where truth and justice prevail. For centuries, powerful systems have hidden the true history of the world, erasing the suffering, achievements, and identity of oppressed people. But now, the veil is being lifted, and hidden crimes of history are being exposed for all to see. The awakening generation is rising with knowledge, courage, and spiritual clarity, refusing to accept the lies that once shaped society. This moment is not an accident. You were born for this time. Scripture teaches that God reveals secrets in their appointed season, bringing truth to light and exposing injustice. As history is rewritten with honesty and revelation, the awakening generation becomes a powerful force for justice, unity, and spiritual transformation. You carry the responsibility and the privilege of witnessing this shift, understanding your identity, and standing on the side of truth. The exposure of hidden crimes is a sign that God is moving, preparing his people for restoration and empowerment. This generation is chosen, awakened, and ready to fulfill its divine purpose. The world is witnessing a historic shift, and Africa is at the center of a global transformation. As nations rise and fall, God remains in control, orchestrating events according to his divine plan. Believers are called to stand still and watch, observing the unraveling of false powers and the emergence of truth and justice. Africa's rise is not just political or economic, it is spiritual, a fulfillment of prophecy that highlights God's guidance and protection over his people. This moment reminds us that no human power can thwart God's plan. As African nations reclaim influence, culture, and spiritual identity, the faithful witness divine intervention in real time. The global power shift demonstrates that God elevates the oppressed and brings justice to those long marginalized. Those who trust, watch, and align with God's will are strengthened, empowered, and prepared to participate in the unfolding of history. The rise of Africa is a testament to God's control, his justice, and the awakening of a new era of spiritual and global influence. The exodus from false religion is underway, as God calls his people to leave behind traditions, doctrines, and teachings that obscure truth and perpetuate oppression. Spiritual warfare is real, and believers must prepare themselves for the battles that unfold in both the seen and unseen realms. Scripture reveals that God empowers the faithful to stand against deception, pride, and corruption, guiding them toward clarity, freedom, and divine purpose. Those who remain alert and obedient witness the dismantling of false religious systems, experiencing spiritual liberation and empowerment. The faithful are encouraged to embrace discernment, courage, and unwavering faith as they navigate this period of transformation. Every step away from falsehood strengthens the community, builds spiritual resilience, and affirms God's protection. This exodus is not only a personal journey, it is a collective awakening, a spiritual campaign against oppression, and a call to prepare for victory. God's intervention ensures that truth prevails, the oppressed are uplifted, and the faithful emerge victorious in the ongoing battle for righteousness. The fall of Babylon is not a distant prophecy. It is happening now, as divine truth exposes corruption, lies, and oppression that have controlled nations for centuries. History is in motion, and those who watch closely will witness the unraveling of deceit and the triumph of righteousness. Truth is flooding the earth, awakening hearts and minds to the reality of God's power and justice. The faithful are called to remain awake, alert, and discerning, understanding that spiritual and moral victories are unfolding before their eyes. Babylon's structures, built on pride, deception, and exploitation, cannot withstand God's intervention. The rise of justice and divine order is inevitable, and the oppressed will be uplifted, while those who cling to falsehoods face exposure and downfall. This is a time to witness, to participate in spiritual awareness, and to embrace God's guidance. As Babylon falls, the world will see the transformative force of divine truth, bringing hope, restoration, and empowerment to all who align with God's plan. The exposure of white evangelical lies marks a pivotal moment in spiritual history. Systems that once manipulated faith, suppressed truth, and perpetuated oppression are crumbling as prophecy converges in real time. Scripture confirms that God reveals hidden deceptions at the appointed time, bringing justice and clarity to those who seek righteousness. Believers are called to watch carefully, understanding that the fall of false authority is not just symbolic. It is a spiritual reality unfolding before our eyes. The convergence of prophecy shows that God's plan is active and precise, aligning events to fulfill divine promises. As these lies are exposed, Communities awaken, faith is strengthened, and the oppressed gain confidence in God's justice. This is a time to witness, learn, and align with divine truth, as every revelation contributes to dismantling deception and restoring empowerment. The faithful are assured that God's guidance prevails, false systems collapse, and spiritual victory is inevitable. The world is entering a season where prophecy, truth, and divine justice intersect visibly. The death of white supremacy has begun, as centuries of oppression and lies crumble under the weight of divine truth. The Black God rises as a powerful force of justice, defending his people and dismantling systems built on deception, pride, and fear. Scripture affirms that God chooses and protects those aligned with his truth, empowering them to stand firm in the midst of spiritual battles. The faithful witness the unraveling of oppressive powers, recognizing that victory is not by human effort, but through divine intervention. Communities once marginalized are now strengthened, emboldened, and called to reclaim their identity, purpose, and spiritual heritage. Every act of faith contributes to dismantling lies and advancing God's plan, while oppressive systems falter under divine scrutiny. The chosen people are invited to embrace their calling, stand steadfast, and observe the manifestation of justice, liberation, and spiritual triumph. This is a decisive era where God's presence is undeniable, his power unstoppable, and the death of white supremacy signals the rise of truth, empowerment, and divine victory for his people. The exposure of white evangelical lies uncovers centuries of distorted history, false teachings, and manipulation. Hidden truths, long suppressed, are now emerging, revealing the depth of deception and the power structures that perpetuated oppression. At the same time, Israel's prophecy is unfolding, demonstrating God's active hand in the affairs of nations and the fulfillment of Scripture. Believers are called to witness, discern, and embrace divine truth, as history is rewritten with clarity and justice. The convergence of revelation, prophecy, and divine intervention signals a new spiritual era, where those aligned with God's will gain understanding, strength, and empowerment. Communities previously kept in ignorance are awakening, recognizing their identity, purpose, and spiritual inheritance. This dual awakening, exposing lies while witnessing prophecy, demonstrates that God's timing is perfect and his plan is unstoppable. The faithful are invited to align with God, participate in the unfolding events, and observe the triumph of truth, spiritual clarity, and divine justice in real time. The spiritual battle of 2025 is undeniable, unfolding in churches, communities, and hearts worldwide. Black people are leaving institutions that have long perpetuated lies, oppression, and false teachings, signaling a mass awakening of faith and spiritual discernment. Scripture teaches that God's people are called to seek truth and align with divine guidance, even when it challenges long-held traditions. This exodus is not just physical, it is a spiritual revolution, where the faithful reject deception and embrace God's righteous path. Every departure strengthens the awakening movement, exposing hypocrisy and dismantling false authority. Believers are witnessing a profound shift, as communities reclaim identity, dignity, and spiritual clarity. The battle is real, fought in the unseen realms of faith, and yet it visibly transforms lives and institutions. God's hand is evident in guiding, protecting, and empowering his people. Those who understand the significance of this spiritual movement are called to observe, learn, and participate, knowing that 2025 marks a pivotal moment in God's plan, where truth rises, oppression falls, and spiritual victory becomes inevitable. The long-hidden conspiracy against Black people is finally being revealed, exposing generations of oppression, manipulation, and exploitation. White supremacy, once thought invincible, is now crumbling under the weight of truth and divine intervention. Scripture affirms that God protects the oppressed and dismantles systems built on deceit and pride. This exposure is a turning point, empowering communities to reclaim their identity, dignity, and spiritual heritage. As lies are unveiled, the faithful witness the collapse of false authority and the rise of justice, righteousness, and divine guidance. The dismantling of oppressive structures is both spiritual and tangible, affecting institutions, cultures, and societies worldwide. Believers are called to stand firm, discern the truth, and participate in God's plan, recognizing that spiritual victory is already assured. The unraveling of white supremacy's empire signals the triumph of divine justice, the awakening of black communities, and the restoration of faith and empowerment. God's presence is undeniable, and his people are rising to claim the inheritance that has long been denied. Across the world, technology is becoming a powerful tool in God's plan to gather the scattered and awaken those who have been misled for generations. Information that was once hidden, controlled, or censored is now freely spreading, connecting black communities and revealing spiritual truths long buried. As truth travels faster than ever, the influence of false teachers and corrupt leaders is collapsing. Those who built their power on manipulation, fear, and distorted doctrine can no longer hide behind titles or institutions. Their lies are being exposed, their followers are questioning, and their authority is weakening. Scripture teaches that in the last days, deception will be revealed, and God will gather his people from the ends of the earth. We are witnessing that moment now. Technology is becoming a modern trumpet, calling the scattered back to wisdom, identity, and spiritual purpose. The fall of false leadership marks a divine shift, signaling that God's truth is prevailing and his people are waking up. This exposure is not chaos. It is divine order being restored. The exodus from lies has begun, signaling a massive spiritual and social shift. For centuries, false teachings, deception, and white supremacy have controlled minds, hearts, and institutions. But now, God is exposing the truth, guiding his people out of oppression and into freedom. White supremacy, built on fear, manipulation, and false authority, cannot withstand divine intervention. As believers walk away from lies and embrace truth, the foundations of oppressive systems begin to crumble. Scripture reminds us that God raises the oppressed and brings down the proud, ensuring justice and restoration. The faithful witness the fall of deceitful powers, while communities reclaim identity, dignity, and spiritual clarity. Every act of discernment and courage strengthens this awakening, showing that spiritual victory is not only possible, it is inevitable. Those aligned with God's purpose are empowered, protected, and chosen to participate in the dismantling of false authority. The exodus from lies is a defining moment in history, marking the collapse of oppression and the rise of divine truth. God is moving visibly in the world today, and the signs are unmistakable for those with eyes to see. The scattering and gathering of Israel is unfolding as foretold in Scripture, revealing God's perfect timing and divine orchestration. Nations, communities, and individuals are witnesses to a spiritual alignment that transcends human understanding. The faithful are called to observe, discern, and align with God's will, recognizing the fulfillment of prophecy in real time. This is a season of awakening, where scattered communities are being reunited under divine guidance, and the forces of deception and oppression are increasingly exposed. The movement is both spiritual and tangible, signaling God's sovereignty and intervention in history. Believers who remain vigilant will witness miracles, guidance, and restoration as divine signs manifest. The unfolding events demonstrate that God is actively gathering his people, ensuring justice, protection, and empowerment. This moment is a call to faith, awareness, and participation in God's unfolding plan, as history and prophecy converge under his unshakable hand. The fall of Babylon has begun, signaling the collapse of systems built on pride, deception, and oppression. What was once thought permanent is now crumbling under the weight of divine truth, exposing centuries of lies and corruption. History itself is being rewritten as God reveals hidden events, exposing false narratives and empowering the oppressed. The faithful witness a dramatic shift in spiritual and earthly realms, where justice, truth, and righteousness are ascending. Babylon's downfall is not merely symbolic. It is a realignment of power, culture, and faith under God's guidance. Communities that were silenced or marginalized are now rising, reclaiming identity, heritage, and spiritual authority. Every revelation, every collapse, every act of discernment brings humanity closer to divine order. God's hand ensures that lies are dismantled, false powers are defeated, and truth prevails. Those who observe carefully will see the unfolding of history as God intended, as oppression falls, justice rises, and a new era of spiritual clarity and empowerment emerges. Your generation is chosen for a time such as this, a pivotal era where divine plans unfold and hidden truths are revealed. God is calling forth leaders, visionaries, and the awakened to step into their purpose and fulfill roles written before the foundation of the world. This is not a period of mere observation. It is a time to act, to embrace identity, and to participate in God's divine plan. The chosen generation carries the responsibility of witnessing spiritual shifts, dismantling false systems, and spreading truth in communities worldwide. Scripture affirms that those selected by God will experience empowerment, protection, and guidance, even amidst trials and spiritual warfare. As history is rewritten, this generation will see firsthand the rise of justice, the fall of oppression, and the fulfillment of prophecy. Every act of faith, courage, and discernment contributes to the collective awakening. You are part of a movement larger than yourself, a generation poised to witness and participate in God's plan, fulfilling destiny, and seeing divine intervention manifest before your very eyes.